including courses on Hans Christian Andersen, Northern European comics, fitting, contemporary Scandinavian stories, and Copenhagen as a city of culture. She received her PhD from the University of Copenhagen with a thesis on time and space in comics. She researches space and place in comics in the Nordic countries, and her latest peer-reviewed publication is Kverneland and Fiske in the Footsteps of Great Artists, Retracing as a Tool for Artist Biographies in Comics Form. And tonight, Dr. Cortsen will be presenting on Imagining the North, Comics and Graphic Novels in the Nordic Countries. Let's welcome Dr. Cortsen.
Yes, I need this. Thank you all so much for coming. First of all, I want to thank, of course, Pacific Lutheran University for inviting me to do this talk, the Scandinavian Cultural Center for hosting us, and I want to say how this is such a great honor for me to be doing the Bjug Harstad lecture. I'm very excited to be here in Tacoma for the very first time. I've had a great time. I'm so enjoying your fall. It's not exactly something we have in Texas. So really, really happy about that. So this is me. Colin already did a really good introduction. So I'm lecturing Danish. I do a lot of work on comics, and that's what I'm talking about today. This is some of the things I've done, and also I teach a course on Northern European comics at UT Austin when I'm not teaching my Danish language course. So as I begin my talk on comics, I want to stress a point that I think is incredibly important to understand, especially if your experience so far with comics has maybe been a little superficial, if you're not that familiar with comics. I think it's important to note that comics is a form of art which can have any kind of comics, any kind of content that the comics creator can imagine. However, when we look at the history of comics, which is some of the examples that I've brought here, certain genres have dominated the form to the point where sometimes genre and content is conflated. So that we tend to think that comics is just superheroes, or that it's just humor comics, or that it's just horror comics. So I would like you, if you take anything from this talk today, to take with you the idea that comics can be on everything. Anything you can imagine, any kind of topic that you want to tell a story about, you can do it in comics form. There's no need to be limited by genres that have historically been very popular in the form. As a researcher, I'm interested in comics as a form. So I have favorites in all the genres. I have a lot of favorite comics, and I'm not particularly into one genre. It's not like I hate some comics and I love other comics. I'm generally interested in the mechanics. How do comics tell a story with text and image? So I think as a reader, you miss out on a lot of really great stories if you have a false belief that, well, comics are just for fun. They're not really for me. Or comics are just for children. They're not really for adults like me. Or comics are only ever about superheroes, so I don't want to read them. I want you to think about that and say, well, maybe comics are for me too. Which brings me to another thing I want to talk about before we dive into the Nordic comics is the idea of the graphic novel. Because this is a term that has, to some degree, helped establish an idea for media and researchers and the cultural sections of newspapers to really think about how comics can transcend these genres, these traditional genres that we used to think comics are just for fun. And this idea of the graphic novel is something that has really helped people think about comics in a new way. Some critics have argued that graphic novel is really just a way of saying expensive comics. It's a way of saying we package it in a nice way, and now you have to pay more for it. Now it's art. other people say, well, it's actually a different thing. It's actually not comics as we know them. Maybe it's something different, and we can actually talk about the graphic novel as something that is unique. So that is what some of my colleagues, two comics researchers, Jan Bartens and Hugo Frey, have been studying. They wrote this book about the graphic novel. And they talk about why there are certain characteristics about graphic novels that you can point to and you can think about. So form, for instance. They're saying these comics sometimes they have a different layout. Sometimes they have a different narrative voice. It's more prominent. Very often it has more experimental styles, and we will see that in some of the comics we're looking at. They also point to content. These comics, they deal with different stuff. They have different stories. And we talk about adult. So that might, yes, mean violence or sex. It can also just mean content that kids are not interested in, right? Boring stuff, everyday, over the kitchen sink kind of stories the kids are not really interested in. So this idea that comics are no longer for children also has to do with it's not necessarily something that children are interested in, but adults might be. It's also, some of these stories are more realistic, as opposed, again, to, for instance, superheroes, sci-fi, fantasy, and very often they're autobiographical. So it has to do with, if we think about the graphic novel, many of them have a different type of content. Then we talk about publication format. That's where the book comes in. It's very often it's a long story. Maybe it's 300 pages. It's not a little floppy comic book. It's a longer form. However, many of the comics that we buy as graphic novels have been serialized in little floppy comic books, put together in a book. And that's because think about how long it takes to draw 350 pages of graphic novel. That takes years. So you publish them in little segments, and then you put them together in a bigger narrative. And then some of them are produced as a one story and then put out in just one book. And then the last thing they point to is production and distribution. So at least in the US, there has been a tradition of big comics publishers, DC, Marvel, for instance. But what we're seeing is that the graphic novel is very often published by independent publishers, or even some of the big publishers that publish what I've called books. That's novels without pictures, right? Text books, text novels. So you have a publisher that's traditionally they're publishing novels, but now they're publishing comics, graphic novels as well. So these are some of the things where they've been looking at a lot of comics, and they're saying, well, you know, there is such a thing as the graphic novel. Personally, I tend to think that graphic novels are also comics, but that if calling them graphic novels makes more readers go and read these stories, I'm all for it. It's fine. It's very good that more people will venture into reading this material, which is why I called my lecture here today Comics and Graphic Novels in the Nordic countries, because that, hopefully that gets as many people as possible to come, because some people are going to say, I love graphic novels, I'm going to go see that lecture. Some people are, well, I like comics, I'll go see it. So hopefully you will all get what you came for. For those of you still perhaps a little curious about how does one do a PhD in comics, that's a question that I sometimes get asked, sometimes also with giggles, and sometimes with what is actually on your certificate. It says comics. But I want to talk a little bit about how this is a field that has really grown in recent years. When I started out 15 years doing research into this, it was difficult to get your stuff published. It was there weren't many conferences, and now there are a ton of conferences, a lot of different subfields. There are journals, people are doing PhDs. There's a lot of comic studies associations, courses in universities like the one I teach, but also entire degree programs. So there are places in the world where you can go and you can do your degree in comic studies. It's a very interdisciplinary field, which is what I like about it, that you get a lot of crossovers, a lot of people come together because, like me, they're interested in the form, but the form can do a lot of different things. One example is graphic medicine, the crossover between health sciences and comic books. I'll get into that, show some examples later on. But also, of course, languages. I use a lot of comics in my language teaching. Arts, artistic research, sociology, history, science dissemination. If you're trying to explain physics to people, why not make a comic about it? It might make it easier to understand. So there's a lot of work being done in this. Law, graphic justice, how is the intersection between comics and law? So that's just to say, well, it's a field that's growing, it's becoming very interdisciplinary, and it's spread all over the world. When we look at comics, there used to be 3 main groups: Francophone comics, Anglophone comics, and Asian comics. But comics are being made all over the world, and comics are being studied all over the world. And then part of the reason why this is possible is because more and more people are making comics. For instance, the graphic novel has made people that before maybe they weren't interested in comics come to the field and say, well, maybe I want to do a comic too, or a graphic novel. And that has then made people interested in the history of comics. So now we're seeing historical reprints. We can go back and we can study some of the very early comics, because the early history of comics, you read a comic and you threw it away. It was kind of this ephemeral cultural product. And now people are putting nice editions of older comics out so that we can all get a chance to read some of the great classics. So a lot of things are happening in comic studies. But we should get on with what we're here for. Nordic contemporary comics, which is what I'm going to talk about today. So I'm going to include a few historical examples, but I will mainly be focusing on what's happening right now in the Nordic countries. I will show as many examples as I could fit in, because I think really when you're studying comics, a lot of it is looking at what does it look like? What is the visual expression of this material that we're talking about? And although I have made sure that many of them are translated into English, I have made a handout that has some of the comics that you can find in English. I will also show a few examples that have yet to find an English language audience. I have grouped it into different types of trends that I'm seeing at the moment. I'm going to talk about newspaper strips and blogs, women in comics, autobiography, independent comics, and then I'll briefly discuss Scandinavian superheroes. Is that a thing? We will get to that. So there's a little teaser there. Let's get into it. I know you've been anxious to see what does Nordic comics look like. So in general, comics in the Nordic countries, at various points in history, they have been inspired by global trends. But there are, of course, also some areas where they differ. Newspaper strips, that's a very old format within comics. It's been a very key format, and in the history of comics, it's been also a very popular format in the Nordic countries. One of the first global popular Nordic comics was this one, Oscar Jakobsson's Adamsson, or Silent Sam, as he was called when he made his appearances abroad. It's a very popular strip that went global, and you can see part of the reason why. It's a pantomime strip, so it doesn't have any text. It doesn't need any translation. You can just distribute it, and people can read the images and get the joke. This kind of simple line drawing and the humor is very universal. It's not something that is unique to Sweden. It's not something where you need a context to get the joke. These stories are in the form of you read the panels, and then at the last end, hopefully you laugh. There's a joke there at the end. So this is the 1920s. This is an early example. If we move a little further, we get to the Moomins. It's another one of my favorite early strips. It's Swedish-speaking Finn Tove Jansson. Her stories about the Moomins. She wrote books about the Moomins. She made picture books. And she made this comic strip, which was published originally, it started in 1947 in a Swedish language newspaper. And then she was contacted by the Evening News in England, and she started publishing the strip in English. And that's why we have this, a lot of strips in English, and they have been collected into these collections where I've taken one of the strips from. She also has this very clear line, very clear style. She's very economic with the way she uses the space in the panels. There's not a lot of confusing things going on. It's very focused on making an atmosphere, telling you where we are, what's happening. And then you can also notice how in this strip she's using the panel dividers in a very creative way. These gutters between the panels, she's taking them into the narrative, taking them into the story, so that when Moomin goes from the inside to the outside, he goes through the panel divider, but he goes through a door. And then we have this thermometer showing us how cold it really is. And that's why he's shaking when he goes outside. So this very playful way of working with something as simple as a strip. It's 4 images. It's a very simple format of a comic, but she really makes the most of it. And what Tove Jansson also did, which I think is interesting, is that each strip is a little narrative, but you can also put them together, and then there are longer stories. So you had to follow them in the newspaper every day to get the next segment of the story. It really is a serialized narrative, and people were following along. And when you read the collected volumes, you get the whole story, and you can really see how she has thought through these narratives. I have another example here, and we see how they're put together when they're collected in book form, how she plays also again with space. We see the saws here that they've used to saw the hole in the ground. This is a story where the bottom floor of the house has flooded, so they have to figure out what's going on. And she uses that division so that when you see the strips on top of each other, we can see that the water is underneath the hole where they're looking through. So she had this really good grasp of how to use comics to tell stories with. And I think one of the things that also makes Tove Jansson really amazing is the way that she told stories that both adults and kids could read. So it's fun, and it's a really it's a very children-friendly strip, but it's also very philosophical. It's also at points sometimes very dark and has a serious tone, so adults can certainly also get a lot from this strip. I really recommend that you dive into the Moomin Valley. It's a place that's well worth visiting. But if we move closer to our time, it's important to note that when we think about the Nordic countries, they're in this sweet spot in between a lot of other comics cultures. So they're getting American culture, American comics that are translated into the Nordic languages, but also the European album tradition. So they're getting Francophone comics that are also being translated, and especially in Denmark up through the 80s. Supposedly the Danes in the 80s were the nation that read the most comics per capita. They were just reading a lot of comics. And the other readers in the other Nordic countries got their hands on these comics by reading the Danish comics, because the languages are so similar. And if there's a comics you're really interested in, and it hasn't been translated from French, but it's been translated into Danish, then you can still read it. So one of the examples I want to show you is from the 80s, because it has very Nordic content. It is a 15-volume European album comic series made by this group of Danes from 1979 to 2009. It's about the Norse gods, so it's about Norse mythology, and it's called Valhalla. And what we see here is the Danish first editions at the top, and then the Finnish ones at the bottom. So it was a Nordic thing. It got translated into the Nordic languages. Unfortunately, it's not in English, but it's a really interesting series about the Norse gods, retelling the stories from the Eddas in comic book form. But let's go a little closer to our time, to the contemporary. Because I said, well, newspaper strips are very popular. But and some of the most popular artists in the Nordic countries, some of the people that can live off their work, they're making newspaper strips. But of course, newspapers right now are challenged by different publishing formats. The newspapers are not necessarily doing so well. So things are happening in terms of how we see newspaper strips being distributed. Recently, the Norwegian paper Dagbladet announced that they will no longer have comics in their newspaper. So for comics lovers, that's not a good thing. But that does not mean that these comics are dying. They're just going to other platforms. And what we're seeing globally, but also a very strong trend in the Nordic countries, are online comics, blog comics, where somebody makes a comic and they publish it online, gets a big following. And then what happens is that then it starts to wander into different publication formats. I've brought the example here of Man Uthaug, who's a Danish cartoonist who has a blog, and this is one of the strips from her blog. It says, hadn't been eating anything but Rice Krispies for 4 days. And then her husband says, seriously, it's only kids that eats that kind of thing. And she says, true, but to get away with it, you have to be an adult. So those kinds of, stick figure, everyday situations that people can relate to, and you follow it and you follow the blog, and then it gets collected into paper format. So Den Lyse Side down here is a book, a paper book of all the collected strips. You can read them all free online, but people want to have the book. They want to read the strips in the book. And then she does cups. This one says, was in love, and she's pouring these little hearts out in the cup. It's a very cute one, right? And very expressive. I really love these stick figure drawings where we can clearly see what's going on, even if it's very simplified. So there are all these artists that are now getting new audiences online and a much more direct access to your readers. You don't need to go through a publisher necessarily. You can just get in contact, also globally. People who do strips in English online get followers all over the world, for instance. So I brought another example because it references back to something we've already seen before. This is a Swedish artist, Moa Romanova, who did an autobiographical strip about her own life, and then that got published in graphic novel form by the Swedish comics publisher Cartago. And now it's scheduled in 2020 to come out in English on American comics publisher Fantagraphics under the name Goblin Girl. But we see over here, this is an example of what the strip looks like, her everyday life. And of course, the mother is Moomin Mama, who says goodbye to her, and then she's on her phone texting. These kind of autobiographical comics about everyday life. But what I find interesting is this movement from online to paper, different kinds of formats, and different types of readers. And the way that, the paper book is not dead yet. We still want to have the comics. So Moa Romanova and Man Uthaug, they're stylistically, as we saw, very different artists, but they share the blog format, they share the combination of text and image, and they also share the fact that they're women. And that brings us to another important trend in recent Nordic comics. Women are very prominent. So historically, of course, comics has been a kind of a boys' club, but lately women are moving into the scene in great numbers. In Sweden, so much so that this is a poster for the gallery called Room for Comics, Rum för Serier, that has right now an exhibition in Malmö called Comics Matriarchy, Women Are Dominating the Comics World, which in Sweden is not actually an exaggeration. A very large part of comics creators, comics publishers, comics academics, cultural movers and shakers in the Swedish comic scene are women. And if we take a look at, for instance, the Malmö School of Comics, where you learn how to make comics, for the last couple of years, maybe 60% of their students are women. So women are really moving into this field in great numbers. And that means, of course, that there are other themes that are being discussed. New things are coming out in comics form, and especially some of the Swedish female authors have been very activist, very explicit in their fight for equal rights as artists and in talking about women issues. One of the very prominent Swedish female comics artists is Liv Strömquist, who has had a very long career in drawing feminist, humorous comics, which challenges the patriarchy in various ways. She has this squiggly black and white line, and she examines historical events. And then she makes fun of how men have tried to hold on to their power and how different historical events have played out. This just came out in English, Fruit of Knowledge, The Vulva versus the Patriarchy. So this is her comic about the cultural history of women's genitalia. So going through history, looking at what happens and what happens with certain groups of people trying to police women's bodies. And it's humorous, it's funny. So this is some of the things that these women are doing, but of course also other topics. Another way of thinking about women in comics is this Women in Battle, which is a history of women and how they fought for equality by the Norwegians Martha Breen and Jenny Jordal. We see here, this is right after, it's also a historical account focusing on specific women in history. It recently came out in English, and this is where, right after the First World War, women went to war and they helped, they were nurses and they helped with the war effort, and now they're back and they're saying, so about suffrage. You were right, and we were wrong. Yep. So that's when they get the vote, and but they also note some of the differences that are still there. That you had to be at that point, if you were a woman, you had to be 30 to vote because, like it says, you're too young and scatterbrained as a woman to be voting, whereas men could be 21. So all of these facts about historical things that went on with women and different women that have fought that fight is in this Women of Battle, which is of course very explicitly about women and feminist in its take on things. But I also want to show you just a few other examples from contemporary comics, just to show the different variety of styles. This is Jenny Rope, The Island, from an anthology called Color Climax that came out some years ago. It collects a lot of different Nordic comics. And it's a story about someone who's on an island and they're waiting for someone else. Not much happens in this very pared down, very subtle drawing style. And then on the other side, we have Danish artist Rikke Villadsen, The Sea, also recently out in English, which is this very interesting and kind of dreamy story about a fisherman who goes out to sea and he puts out his net, and then out he fishes a baby that can talk and a fish that can talk. And then they have a conversation. And it's very philosophical, and it's also kind of hard to figure out what's going on. But she has this really unique smudged pen or pencil style. It's a fascinating read, and every time I read it, I have to rethink what I think about it. But just also as an example of saying, well, when we looked at some of the other comics, this kind of cartoony, very clear, explicit style, there are also a lot of other ways of drawing in comics. Which takes us into another trend that I want to talk about, autobiography and biography, which is a big trend in contemporary Nordic comics, also globally all over the world, so much so that a lot of people I talk to think that graphic novels are all black and white autobiographies, because there are a lot of them out there. And this is, of course, also a black and white biography / autobiography, because it's Hanna-Rine Mosainen's Isa, and we can see the subtitling underneath, Father, which is what Isa means in Finnish. And when we look at the page, it's a story about her dad who disappeared when she was very young, and she's trying to figure out what happened when he disappeared, and it also is a story about herself. And then we can see it's subtitled. So it's in Finnish, but down here at the bottom we can read it in English. So the Finnish comics scene has a way, they have this tradition of keeping the Finnish text in the layout, but of course when we look at comics, it matters how the page looks. So the Finnish text is still in there, but we can also understand what's going on by reading the English subtitles. So this biography is something that we also see in this trying to get to know your father by writing a comic book story about him. Is something that we also see in this trilogy. It's called the Dane Trilogy by the Danish comics creator Heflin. It's not, unfortunately, translated into English yet, but I just want to show you some of it still because it's one of my favorite comics. Thinking about how Heflin writes this trilogy about his father, who's a Turkish guest worker that comes to Denmark and has trouble fitting in. So he ends up, he becomes a criminal, and he's sort of living at the edges of Danish society, and he's struggling with who he is and how he's going to be a father. And in his comic, Heflin discusses this, and also, of course, he's in the comic himself when he's a little kid. But when we look at it, the first volume is called Deserter, Cockroach, and then Dane. So it's all about different monikers that people have called his father throughout he deserted from the Turkish army, so he was a deserter. He keeps, every time he gets attacked, every time he gets beaten up, he keeps getting back on you can't kill him, he's like a cockroach. And then at the end of the story, he ends up getting his Danish passport, then he's a Dane. But it's also about thinking about what does it mean to be a Dane, how do you become the person you are, and what shaped you, what made you that person. What is important to note here also are the years, 2014, 2015, 2016. I talked about how long time it takes to draw a graphic novel. Heflin is very famous in Danish comic circle for being really, really productive. Just sitting down and doing many comics pages. And I think he has a really interesting style, also again black and white, and it develops throughout this big trilogy. And he recently won a big prize at a comics festival in France, so it's been translated into French. But we see some examples here of how he uses the medium of comics. So these kind of standard regular boxes, the everyday life of his father when he's watching game shows, when he's building snowmen with his kids, he's watching the Queen, it's New Year's, she makes her speech, kind of everyday life. But if we look at the first top of the page, it has these squiggly lines around the panels, which tells us that this has a different quality of reality. It's not the everyday life. And if we look at the sixth panel, we can see that he's sleeping. So maybe it's a dream. Maybe it's something that he's imagining. And Heflin really works with how to use the comic to have these different levels of reality and uses a lot of visual metaphor. That's one of the things that is also a great strength, of course, with comics, is that you can show things. You don't have to tell them. You can make metaphors that are visual and not literal. So biography. Another biography I want to show you is the Norwegian artists Lars Fiske and Steffen Kverneland. They do a lot of collaborations, and we see them here at the top. Lars Fiske has drawn them. And then at the bottom, we see them worshipping their idol, Olaf Gulbrandsson, a Norwegian artist that they did an artist biography about. And I think it's interesting the way that they collaborate, because when they draw, and they draw like themselves, you can see very clearly who drew what. So they collaborate and they go places, and they're very enthusiastic about their favorite artist. So they published this little magazine where they both published their comics. So, which ended up being, I talked about serializing things and then putting them in book form. This first one is Lars Fiske's biography of the Dadaist poet Cortsen, and then the biography of Edvard Munch, the very famous Norwegian artist. And when we see them, These are some of the examples of what they look like on the insides. We can see Lars Fiske has this very angular style, but also this page is, it's a fight. It's a fight that happens because in the comic, Cortsen is a Dadaist poet. And when you're a Dadaist poet and you go to read your poetry, people in the audience want to fight because it's meaningless and they don't understand it, and they got in fights all the time. So what we're seeing here are these poets, and in the blue panel we can see how they're very proudly walking away with a lot of bruises. They just fought for their art. But the layout is mimicking Cortsen's own art, a lot of the Merzbau, the sculptures that he built, but also some of his collages. So what Lars Fiske is doing is he's using the comics to mimic the artist that he's doing a biography of, which is also what we see Stefan Kvandeland doing in the other page from the Munch book. This is a kind of sketchy drawing. This is Lars Fiske and Stefan Kvandeland, and they're walking around Oslo and they're trying to find the point where Edvard Munch painted The Scream, the very famous painting, The Scream. And they're walking around and they're talking about it, and all of a sudden Stefan Kvandeland says, well, this doesn't really matter because he painted it from memory in Berlin. So we can't really find the spot. But we can see there in the background the sky, the very famous sky that is also reproduced here. We can see that's the bridge where the person with the scream and the sky in the background is sneaking into this explanation. So the scream is there, and Edvard Munch's painting style is something that Stefan Kvandeland copies in his artist biography. So using style as a way of showing certain things and adding extra layers of meaning to the story that you're telling. In this case, artist biography. I also want to show you a different type of autobiography. I talked about graphic medicine and how healthcare can intersect with comics. This is a story by the Finnish artist Kaisa Lekka. I Am Not These Feet. It's a story about how she decided to get the lower half of her legs amputated because she had an illness that made it impossible for her to walk without severe pain. So we see the cover of the comic. There are all these pictures of her with her new legs. But also a page from this kind of diary book where she draws figures so they look like Mickey Mouse, which of course is also a visual choice. And in this, she also uses the repetition of panels. They look almost identical, but it says underneath the hospital cook, the nurse, a head nurse, labyrinth, anesthetist, the surgeon, all of them ask, are you sure you want to do this? Are you sure you want to do this? Are you sure you want to do it? And she's pretty sure. And then at the end, on second thought, I'm not sure I want to do this, because all of these people have been constantly questioning her choice to do this. And I think that that's a really great example of what it is that repetition in comics can do, and you can really get the point across in a very simple drawing style through this use of repeating panels and also indicating this diary style. Everyone at the hospital thinks I'm mad, is the headline, because of course this is a very severe decision. So the book is about, she goes through with it, and how do you learn how to walk again, and she finds out that there are a lot of places online where you can get really cool prosthetic feet, and she gets them and she starts biking all over Europe with them. So this is the type of narrative that we're seeing a lot in graphic medicine, talking about your illness story, and through that connecting with other people that have the same story, but also visualizing and putting into image what can sometimes be very difficult to put into words, which is, I think, one of the strengths of comics. You can show things rather than tell them. So this is a lot. There's a lot of overlap between these groups that I've tried to. So of course, Kaisa Lekka is also a woman, so she could have been in the women in comics section. And autobiography, it's a trend, but it's also part of an experimental and independent comic scene. And I think one of the things that's interesting about the comic scene in the Nordic comics countries is that it doesn't really have a mainstream. you can't really make a lot of money making comics in the Nordic languages. So when I talk to a lot of the artists, they say, well, then if you can't make mainstream comics and you're not trying to please an audience, you might as well just make comics about things that you think is interesting and do it in a way that you think looks interesting. So what we're also seeing is this idea that Nordic comics and Scandinavian comics are more experimental stylistically. I read a lot of the reviews that came out with this anthology of comics, Color Climax, and what a lot of the foreign reviewers were talking about is that they don't look like the comics that we're used to, and they're doing different things, and they're talking about different topics. They're more experimental. I think that that's an interesting part also of the comic scene. They're very influenced from other global cultures, but they're also doing their own thing and willing to take some risks. The other example I have here is the Finnish avant-garde, independent, experimental comics magazine called Kuti Kuti. They take submissions, so for a long time they've been publishing this newspaper with comics in it, and you can submit your comics, and if they think they're interesting, then you can get published. So this kind of experimental underground, definitely not making a lot of money, but seeing a lot of creativity and a lot of interesting things. And one of the founders of Kuti Kuti is a Finnish artist called Tommi Musturi, that I also want to just say a few words about, because his book, The Book of Hope, came out in English. We can see here how he has a very strong use of color. There are so many elements we can talk about when we talk about what comics look like, and he has this kind of clear line, cartoony style. Simply Samuel and Samuel in Matkassa, Traveling with Samuel, they're pantomime comics. So you don't actually, you can read it in German or you can read it in the Finnish version. There are no words in it. But it's about this little figure, Samuel. He goes on travels in these interesting environments. And this very bright colored, very distinctive style. And then also the Book of Hope was serialized, like, again, little stories put together in a big book about an elderly couple, and they live out in the countryside. And what do you do when you're approaching the end of life and you start thinking about what happened in your life? So we have flashbacks from his youth and from when they were young, but also these kind of everyday life things that happens. It's very philosophical. It's very serious. It's also very funny. So this mixture of seriousness, philosophical content, and also a certain kind of humor. And every time I teach this book, my students always love it, and they want to keep talking about it, and they want to keep discussing this. And the interesting thing is, if you have to do a summary, nothing really happens. Like, you can't do a summary, like, then he goes out, and then he sort of sits there. But it's so moving, and it's still something that keeps, I can see when I'm grading papers, that it keeps popping up in the papers. It's something that really stays with you, and it's a very distinctive visual style. So it's certainly also one of the ones that are worth checking out. So these are some of the things that I wanted to show you, but I also promised you superheroes. So we'll talk a little bit about Scandinavian superheroes, because it's a fascinating thing. When we look at the history of comics, superheroes is a very American thing. There are also other countries that have taken in the superhero, but it is a very American genre. And what we see in the Scandinavian comics is that the ones that are homegrown, for instance, like Bjotman, the Norwegian superhero there, or the Finnish Peramies, which is drawn in a very distinctively American underground style, if you know American underground comics, or Danish Duksedreng. All of these are parodies. All of these are making fun of and playing with the genre of superheroes. We're not seeing a lot of not serious superheroes, not dark Batman, I'm working with my trauma, this is difficult, this is serious things. The superheroes in the Scandinavian countries, they're kind of silly, and they all work with this trope of wearing your underwear as part of your suit, right? We see that. It's long sleeve underwear, and he's also... So this idea that Superman is running around with his underwear on top of his pants is something that crops up all the time. And then we're also seeing, of course, parodies of American superheroes, where reimagining, you know, what if Batman wasn't this kind of amazing superhero? What if he was just a really obnoxious guy that you had to work with, and he wasn't treating you really well? So there's a lot of comedy, there's a lot of humor with the superheroes in the Scandinavian countries. But I haven't really been able to find a superhero that was deeply serious, Nordic kind of superhero. So I want to conclude just by saying these are a few other examples of comics. By just concluding that if we look at the comic scene currently in the Nordic comics, there's a lot of variety. There's, in terms of style, in terms of content, comics are booming all over the world. People are making comics, but we're also seeing that in the Nordic countries. There might be something with the Nordic countries that they're experimental or they're a little different. Some outside reviewers tend to think that there's a Nordicness about some of the comics, which I think is difficult to pin down. And as someone from the Nordic countries reading these comics, it's difficult to see what is it that makes them special, especially because you can clearly see all the influences from what is going on in pop culture, what is going on in the comic scene in the rest of the world, and how the comics artists in the Nordic countries are taking that in. So I want to thank you for listening, and I would love to answer questions. Thank you.
Where does someone who knows nothing about it get started? Where do you start? Like are there like stores? And of course, I've not had any reason to look, so I never saw.
Right. Thank you for that. That's a very good question. Probably the one I wanted to get the most, because that's going to send you all in there to go get the comics, right? The thing is that we have, of course, specialty comic book stores where you go and you get your comics. And you can go there because they will also have some of these comics. They might also be able to order home, and you say, I like this, I want to check out this Nordic comic. But what we're seeing more and more, and that's where I'm really happy about the idea of the graphic novel, is that really made the comics go into bookstores. So you can go into a well-stocked bookstore will probably have a graphic novel section. Where you can find different types of comics, of course also American comics. And they probably also will be able to help you if you say, well, I know it's this publisher, and can you help me get this comic? Which is one of the things that really transitions comics into a much broader audience, because if you're in the bookstore anyway, and you see this beautiful cover, and you flick through it, oh, this looks nice, I might just try this. But whereas if it's a specialty store, and I mean, there's a lot of stereotypes about people who read comics. But there is this kind of stereotype that you had to go into a basement, and then there's, the guy from The Simpsons, the comic book guy, he's there behind it. And you don't necessarily feel welcome if you're not somebody who can answer like very obscure questions about Superman, right? But what we're seeing is that it's going into bookstores, it's becoming more, you're reading the cultural section of some of the main newspapers, and they have reviews of graphic novels. So it's getting there, and it's reaching different audiences also. So I would say, if you want to start, what do you like? What kind of books do you like to read? Find comics that are like, there's a lot of different comics about, do you like reading autobiography? Then, try finding some of the best one, and the other way is thinking about the content, but also looking at them. What do you like looking at? Because style is so individual. When I teach my comics courses, I have students that say, I hate comics with color. They're not serious. I don't want to read them. I don't like reading color comics. And then in the same class, I have a student who says, I can't read comics without color. If they're black and white, they're boring. So, our individual taste really matters when we talk about comics. Really good comics, some people will never read them because they really don't like the drawing style. So I would also say, find a place where they have comics and flick through them, or look at, very often the publishers will have pages, examples online, and you can say, oh, I really like this artist. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's a super good comic or that you like the comic, but you like the style, you like looking at it. So, be mindful of your own taste is probably, and that's okay. It's also okay to look at a comic and think, the style doesn't appeal to me. It might be a great classic, but it's not really me. So, I would encourage everyone to go exploring, not just Nordic comics, but if you're especially interested in Nordic comics, then I'm sure that you can find it online. There are a lot of, you can go to the publishers themselves and you can buy them from there. But also ask the bookstores. They can probably help you. Yeah. Thanks.
Is there a correlation between the growth of graphic images, movies, TV, that sort of thing, and parallel growth in comics? Or did comics exist before silent movies, and was there no relationship?
Well, I think the thing is also we're getting into kind of research dangerous waters, because that takes us into the waters of what is the first comic, what is a comic. And that's the sort of thing you can throw it into a room full of comics researchers and it will explode. Because it's a kind of like, what is the first comic? What defines a comic? And some people will say, if you go into the cave paintings, you have sequential art in images. That's comics. Some people will say, no, you need text and image. Well, then it takes us up to maybe the 1700s. Even in the Middle Ages, we have people with scrolls that are actually speech balloons in some of the illustrated manuscripts. So humanity has been telling stories with images since forever. But comics as such, some people will say, it begins when we start mass producing. When we put text and image together, we can print it and we can make, especially in the newspapers. And then we get into also a little bit of a national fight sometimes. American scholars tend to like that The Yellow Kid is the first comic. Some European comics scholars like to think that Rudolf Töpfer, a Swiss artist, he's a little earlier. He does these picture stories with text, that's the first comic. But I think that we can say, if we say comics is something that's it begins in the 1890s with mass production, it goes side by side with movies. And we can see that a lot of the comics artists go into the movies and they see the storytelling with camera angles and zooms and things, and they start popping up in the comics. But we can also see that some movie directors and people who make movies have been reading comics and they know their classics and it makes their way into it. So I think there's the cross-pollination that they go together. And I think there's always this discussion of, kids nowadays, they're not reading, they're just video games, or there's just movies, or, and there's always been some kind of thing. But comics, in the 50s and 40s and early on, so many kids were reading comics. But then there weren't really TV around, there weren't really video games, there wasn't the same kind of competition. So I think stories with images is something that's always been fascinating. It just takes different forms. And that's perhaps also one of the reasons why the idea that comics can be for adults really helped comics survive, because the kids are also doing other stuff. And I want to say, to the point where the graphic novels was so popular that now comics are only for adults. And there was a period in time where we kind of forgot to make good children's comics. Now we're seeing a lot more good children's comics and young adult comics. And if you say, well, who's the best-selling comics author in America right now? you can, I think maybe it's a superhero, maybe it's one of those graphic novels. It's probably Rainer Tegelmeier, who does young adult stories for kids about, or for young adults about different types of stuff, friendship in school. It's a very, very big market now, young adult comics. So it changes all the time. What's the most popular? Yeah.
Do you have thoughts on why feminism and gender studies are so like central in Nordic comics and like Scandinavia in particular, and like why so many women are involved in that there?
I think there are several reasons. In general, I think the Nordic countries are very progressive in terms of gender. Sweden specifically has worked a lot with feminism. They have a feminist political party. Denmark doesn't. So, you know, they have in a lot of ways, they've worked a lot more with feminism as a society. There's also something about how the Nordic countries subsidizes art. So there's a lot of money for different types of art. So you can help get funding. And then also one of the things I've seen is, which sort of related to that, is that the Scandinavian countries also have schools where you can go to a school to learn how to make comics. And what we saw, especially with some of the women that were making comics, is that if you're on your own and you're making your comics, that can be very lonely. But then you go to a school and all of a sudden you realize that there are 5 other women and they're also doing this, and they also think that women can make comics. All of a sudden you're a group and you're helping each other out. And there were these kinds of groups and collectives in Sweden where they published together and they helped each other get published. And then perhaps also if there's a school, you can apply to the school, and if you're good, you can get into the school and you can get the education. So I think that might also be one of the things that can level gender differences. And I think there are a lot of different explanations. I think a lot of it, as with gender equality in general, it also has to do with role models. If you see a comic done by a woman about things that you think is super interesting, then that's going to make you think, oh, I can do that too. So if it's not out there, maybe you won't get that idea, or you will feel that what you're doing is not really something that people want to read. So the more diversity that you're seeing in a medium, it's also going to get more people into the scene, I think. Yeah. A lot of great questions. Thank you so much.
You mentioned that there's a lot of crossovers between different fields of study in comics. Have you seen a lot of Nordic comics on environmentalism?
Not yet, not that much. My guess is that it's out there or it's coming very soon, because it's a topic that people are very preoccupied with. I talked about immigration. That's also a topic that people are really into. We're seeing a lot more immigration comics also in the Nordic countries. And it might also be that I don't know of them yet, that I haven't kept up to speed with all of them. But that's a really good point. My guess is that they will be out there. If they're not already out there, they will be there soon. I've seen some in other countries thinking about environmental disasters and things like that. But it seems like an obvious thing to do comics about, yeah.
So I think we have time for one more question. So here it is.
Do you see a lot of political comics in like Scandinavian comics?
Well, I think that also political comics, like what does that mean? But I think there's the whole tradition of comics and newspapers that are commenting on current political events. So of course that's there. But also Something like some of the examples I was showing with explicitly feminist comics discussing contemporary topics from an explicitly political angle. It might not be that they are with a specific party, but they certainly have attitudes. They have thoughts on contemporary issues that are going on, and there are different types of contemporary issues. And a lot of them are also creating debate and pushing boundaries and making people really think about it. And I think that has to do with the visuality of comics. That if you make a very provocative comic and put it on a wall somewhere, people are waiting for the train, and they see it and they get excited and they start discussing. So there's something about the visuality of comics that also sometimes really gets people talking also about politics. And you can make, I think there are very explicitly political comics, and then there are perhaps more subtle discussions of issues that are happening at the moment. Another example with the feminist comics was that Liv Strömquist I showed, she talked about how when she started out in comics, there was a male comics artist that said to her, well, women don't draw comics about interesting things, they only draw comics about menstruation, because that's what women are, And what the women did, of course, was that they said, yes, we do. So they made an entire anthology that was called Women Only Draw Comics About Menstruation. And they had all of these women drawing stories about this topic. Because, it's an important topic. It's something that a lot of, half the population of the world have experience with. And, the other half also knows what it is. There are things going on. And that's a way of sort of saying, yes, just because men don't draw comics about it doesn't mean that it's not an important topic. Or we're also seeing more diversity with, minorities drawing comics, or different types of sexualities and queer comics. So the field is getting much more diverse, and with that, very often also different types of topics that you want to discuss. That you're very interested in. And then very often you make comics and then you figure out that there are all these other people that love reading your comics that are also interested in this topic. So I would say it depends on what you mean with political, but certainly debating and pushing boundaries, thinking about, topics that we're all thinking about, contemporary topics. Yeah.
So before we say thank you, I just want to say that the conversation's not over. There's refreshments just outside the SCC, so we encourage you to grab some refreshments and continue asking questions. And you can ask Rikke more questions if you want. So, but
Yes.
we want to thank you so much for coming in.
I want to thank you for coming. And do ask questions. I love talking about comics.